The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like wasps trapped in amber, casting harsh shadows across the packed courtroom. Every seat filled with bodies leaning forward, necks craned, eyes fixed on the defendant's table where a single man sat with military precision. His back straight as a rifle barrel, hands folded, dark skin catching the sterile light that seemed to drain warmth from everything it touched. Marcus Johnson wore a plain gray suit that couldn't quite hide the discipline carved into his shoulders. The alertness that never left his eyes even in civilian clothes. 22 years of service had marked him in ways fabric couldn't conceal. The wooden gavel struck its block with the finality of a coffin nail. Judge Harold Brennan peered down from his elevated perch, wire-rimmed glasses, reflecting the courtroom's harsh illumination. His thin lips pressed into a line that suggested distaste, as if the very air had grown sour. The man before him represented everything Brennan found troublesome about modern society: too proud, too confident, too unwilling to accept his place in the natural order of things. The case itself seemed almost mundane on paper. A traffic incident involving Johnson's pickup truck and a local businessman's Mercedes. Property damage. Alleged reckless driving. But the whispers that followed Johnson into the courthouse spoke of darker currents. Some called it targeted harassment. Others muttered about a setup designed to humble a man who'd forgotten his station. The truth lay buried beneath layers of legal procedure and social expectation, waiting for someone brave enough to excavate it. Johnson's attorney, a young public defender named Sarah Chen, shuffled papers with nervous energy. Her client had insisted on minimal representation, declining to mount an aggressive defense that might draw unwanted attention. He'd faced worse than courthouse drama in the mountains of Afghanistan, he'd told her quietly. This too would pass. But Chen could see the calculation in Brennan's eyes, the way the judge's gaze lingered on Johnson's composed features with something approaching contempt. The courtroom gallery buzzed with tension. Front row seats held local businessmen and their wives, faces set in expressions of civic duty masking deeper prejudices. Behind them, scattered veterans in various stages of civilian adaptation watched their brother-in-arms with protective intensity. They'd heard the stories. They knew what Marcus Johnson had done for his country, for men who looked nothing like him, in places where courage meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. But Judge Brennan either didn't know or didn't care about the medals gathering dust in Johnson's apartment. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with V device. Navy Cross. Commendations that spoke of valor under fire, of split-second decisions that saved American lives. In this fluorescent-lit chamber of justice, those honors carried no weight against the assumptions written in the judge's narrowed eyes. The prosecution began its case with theatrical precision. District Attorney Michael Preston, a man whose political ambitions were barely concealed beneath his prosecutorial zeal, painted Johnson as a menace to public safety. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone accustomed to swaying juries with emotion rather than evidence. Each word chosen to diminish. To reduce a decorated war hero to nothing more than another reckless driver who needed to learn respect for law and order. Johnson listened without flinching, as Preston twisted the facts like origami, folding truth into shapes that better served the prosecution's narrative. The accident became willful endangerment. Johnson's calm demeanor transformed into arrogant defiance. His military bearing, evidence of dangerous instability. Preston paced before the jury box, hands gesturing dramatically, voice rising with moral indignation that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. The defendant remained motionless throughout the opening statement, his face a mask of professional composure. But those who knew how to look could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of battles fought on different terrain. Marcus Johnson had survived 3 deployments to Afghanistan, had lain motionless for hours in desert heat waiting for the perfect shot that would save his squad. He could outlast whatever performance this courtroom demanded. Afghanistan felt like another lifetime now, though barely 5 years had passed since his final deployment. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose like broken teeth against skies, so blue they hurt to look at directly. Johnson had been Sergeant First Class then, leading a sniper team through valleys where death whispered from ridge lines and roadside bombs turned morning patrols into memorial services. His rifle had become an extension of his will, each shot precisely calculated to protect American lives and complete impossible missions. The weight of his M107 Barrett rifle had never felt burdensome during those long months of hunting Taliban commanders through unforgiving terrain. 800-meter shots in mountain wind required mathematics most people couldn't comprehend, accounting for elevation, humidity, target movement, and a dozen other variables that separated expert marksmen from soldiers who simply carried rifles. Johnson's accuracy ratings had been legendary among Marine snipers, his confirmed kills a testament to deadly precision applied with surgical care. He'd earned his reputation through actions that would never make it into official reports. Like the night he'd held position for 14 hours in sub-zero temperatures, waiting for a high-value target who might emerge from a compound holding captured American soldiers. His spotter had developed hypothermia, but Johnson remained steady as granite, finger ready on the trigger that could mean life or death for 3 Marines being tortured 50 meters away. When the shot finally came, it traveled through falling snow with the certainty of justice delayed but not denied. The Bronze Star citation spoke of his courage during a Taliban ambush that had pinned down an entire platoon. Johnson had exposed himself to enemy fire, drawing attention while his team relocated to better positions. Shrapnel from an RPG had torn through his left shoulder, but he'd continued engaging targets until the threat was neutralized and his brothers could reach safety. He'd carried 2 wounded Marines to the evacuation helicopter, his own blood mixing with theirs on the aircraft floor. But the medal that mattered most had never been officially awarded. It lived in the grateful eyes of soldiers who'd made it home because Marcus Johnson had been willing to take the shots others couldn't make. 18 confirmed kills, each one a life saved on the American side. Fathers who returned to their children. Sons who lived to see another Christmas. The mathematics of war reduced to its simplest equation, them or us, darkness or light, death or the chance to see home again. Those mountains had taught him patience, that served him well now as District Attorney Preston continued his theatrical denunciation. The prosecutor's voice carried the righteousness of someone who'd never faced actual evil, who'd never held human life in the balance of a trigger pull. His accusations felt like gentle rain compared to the mortars that had fallen around Johnson's positions, his moral outrage laughable to a man who'd stared through rifle scopes at genuine monsters. Yet Johnson felt the familiar weight settling in his chest, the burden of being judged by people who'd never walked his path. They saw his skin color first, his service record last, if at all. The same country he'd bled for now questioned his character over a traffic accident that any reasonable investigation would have dismissed. The irony tasted bitter as copper pennies, metallic and sharp like the blood he'd spat after that Taliban ambush 5 years ago. Preston's voice rose toward crescendo, hands waving dramatically as he described Johnson's alleged reckless disregard for public safety. Each accusation landed like a calculated insult, designed to strip away dignity and reduce a war hero to a stereotype that played well with certain audiences. The prosecutor painted pictures of a dangerous man who couldn't control his impulses, who brought battlefield violence into peaceful civilian spaces. Judge Brennan nodded along with Preston's performance, occasionally making notes that seemed more theatrical than functional. His expression suggested someone sampling spoiled milk, disgust carefully cultivated for maximum impact. When Preston finally concluded his opening statement, Brennan's eyes swept the courtroom with the satisfaction of a predator sensing wounded prey. The judge's voice carried the authority of absolute power when he addressed Johnson directly. His words were carefully chosen to appear professional while carrying undertones sharp as razor wire. He questioned Johnson's understanding of civilian law, his ability to function in polite society, his fitness to walk among decent people without supervision. Each phrase crafted to humiliate, to remind everyone present of the natural hierarchy that placed certain people above others. Johnson absorbed the verbal assault with the same steady calm he'd maintained under Taliban fire. His military training had prepared him for interrogation, for psychological pressure designed to break his will and compromise his mission. This courthouse theater paled in comparison to techniques employed by enemy forces who'd specialized in breaking captured Americans. He'd survived worse than Judge Brennan's thinly veiled contempt. But the weight accumulated anyway, pressing down like the pack he'd carried through Afghan valleys. Not the physical burden. Johnson could carry 200 pounds for 20 miles without complaint, but the spiritual load of watching his country turn its back on the very values he'd sworn to defend. The Constitution he'd pledged to support and defend seemed like a fragile document in this fluorescent-lit chamber, where justice bent to accommodate prejudice. The memories came unbidden as Preston resumed his attack. Johnson saw himself again at 22, fresh from boot camp, believing absolutely in the righteousness of his cause and the gratitude of his countrymen. That young Marine would have been shocked to see where idealism led to this defendant's table, this sneering judge, this prosecution that treated military service as evidence of potential criminality rather than patriotic sacrifice. His squad leader's voice echoed across the years, Sergeant Miller's Kentucky drawl cutting through the noise of helicopters and artillery. "Johnson, son, you remember this, we don't fight for the politicians or the people back home who wave flags when it's convenient. We fight for each other, for the man to your left and right, for the idea that someone has to stand between evil and innocent people who sleep safely in their beds." Miller had died 3 weeks later, when their convoy hit an IED, but his words lived on in Johnson's memory, like sacred text. The prosecution called its first witness, the businessman whose Mercedes had been damaged in the collision. Robert Haversham approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference, his expensive suit and perfect teeth marking him as a member of the community's elite. His testimony painted Johnson as an aggressive driver who deliberately caused the accident, his words carefully crafted to suggest premeditation and malice. Under cross-examination, Sarah Chen attempted to poke holes in Haversham's story, but Judge Brennan consistently sustained objections to her most probing questions. The pattern became clear: Johnson's defense would be permitted only the most superficial challenges while the prosecution enjoyed free rein to assassinate his character. The scales of justice tilted heavily, weighted by assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence or law. Johnson watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a theatrical performance. He'd seen kangaroo courts before, in places where justice was a luxury few could afford. Military tribunals in forward operating bases at least maintained the pretense of fairness. But this civilian courtroom seemed less concerned with truth than with reinforcing social order. He was being punished not for his actions, but for his refusal to apologize for existing, for serving, for believing he deserved the same respect accorded to lesser men with lighter skin. The hours crawled past like wounded animals seeking shelter. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about Johnson's alleged character flaws, his supposed tendency toward violence, his inability to adapt to civilian life. None of them mentioned his charitable work with homeless veterans, his volunteer hours at the VA hospital, his patient mentoring of young Marines struggling with the transition to civilian careers. Those facts didn't serve the narrative Preston was constructing. Judge Brennan's bias became impossible to ignore as the day progressed. He allowed leading questions from the prosecution while sharply limiting the defense's ability to challenge witness testimony. His rulings consistently favored Preston's case, each decision another brick in the wall being built around Johnson's reputation. The courtroom audience watched the systematic destruction of a war hero's dignity with the fascination of spectators at a public execution. But Johnson had learned patience in places where hasty decisions meant death. He'd waited 18 hours for a single shot that would break a siege threatening an American outpost. He'd endured weeks of psychological warfare from Taliban propagandists who'd tried to convince him his country had forgotten him. This courthouse humiliation was just another mission requiring endurance rather than action. Another test of his ability to maintain discipline under pressure. The memories of Afghanistan provided unexpected comfort as Judge Brennan's performance reached new heights of theatrical contempt. Johnson remembered the Afghan translator who'd risked his family's safety to help American forces locate Taliban weapons caches. Mahmoud had been a small man with gentle eyes and a fierce loyalty that shamed the conditional patriotism Johnson encountered back home. When Taliban fighters had captured Mahmoud's village, Johnson had volunteered for the rescue mission that brought him home safely. That operation had required 3 days of movement through hostile territory, carrying extra water and ammunition for a man most Americans would never know existed. But Johnson and his team had understood something that seemed lost on Judge Brennan and District Attorney Preston. Service meant protecting all Americans, regardless of their race, religion, or political beliefs. The Constitution they'd sworn to defend didn't include footnotes, excluding certain citizens from equal protection. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting longer shadows across the courtroom floor. Johnson's attorney made valiant attempts to present mitigating evidence, but Brennan's rulings limited her effectiveness to token gestures. The judge seemed determined to conduct a sentencing hearing disguised as a trial, his verdict already written in the curl of his lip and the dismissive wave of his hand. As Preston prepared to call his final witness, the courtroom doors opened with a sound like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Heads turned as a figure emerged from the bright hallway beyond, silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse entrance. The newcomer's steps echoed with military precision across the marble floor, each footfall announcing the arrival of someone accustomed to command. General Patricia Morrison entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who'd earned her authority through decades of exemplary service. 4 stars gleamed on her uniform shoulders, marking her as one of only a handful of women to achieve that rank in Marine Corps history. Her presence transformed the atmosphere from circus to ceremony, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the theatrical posturing that had dominated the proceedings. Johnson recognized her immediately, though they'd never met personally. General Morrison had been a colonel during his first deployment, her reputation legendary among Marines who served in Afghanistan. She'd commanded forward operating bases, led combat missions, and earned the respect of enlisted men and officers alike, through actions rather than political maneuvering. Her Purple Heart had been earned leading Marines out of a Taliban ambush, her body shielding wounded soldiers from enemy fire. The general walked slowly down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on Johnson with an expression that spoke volumes about honor, sacrifice, and the bonds that connected all who'd worn the uniform in service to their country. She took a seat in the front row, directly behind the defendant's table, her presence a silent rebuke to everyone who'd spent the day diminishing a fellow Marine's reputation. Judge Brennan seemed suddenly uncertain, his theatrical confidence wavering in the face of Morrison's quiet authority. The prosecutor's voice faltered mid-sentence, as he recognized the implications of her arrival. This was no longer a simple traffic case but something approaching a reckoning, a moment when the gap between civilian assumptions and military reality would be exposed for all to see. Johnson felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tension he'd carried for months. The general's presence didn't change the facts of his case, didn't alter the evidence or the witness testimony. But it reminded everyone present that he was more than the sum of their prejudices, more than the stereotype they'd constructed to justify their contempt. He was a Marine, a brother in arms, a man who'd earned respect through blood and sacrifice. Preston struggled to regain his momentum, calling character witnesses, whose testimony suddenly seemed petty and small in the presence of someone who'd commanded thousands of Marines in combat zones. The businessmen and local officials who'd lined up to condemn Johnson now appeared diminished, their civilian concerns dwarfed by the weight of military honor represented by the general's stars. The courtroom atmosphere continued to evolve as word of Morrison's presence spread through whispered conversations and subtle gestures. Veterans in the gallery straightened their shoulders, their faces reflecting pride and recognition. Even civilians who'd never worn a uniform seemed to sense they were witnessing something significant, a moment when abstract concepts like duty and honor took physical form. Judge Brennan called a brief recess, presumably to compose himself and decide how to proceed with a four-star general observing his performance. But Morrison's presence had already achieved its purpose, transforming the narrative from condemnation to recognition, from humiliation to honor. She'd said nothing, done nothing except claim her seat and watch the proceedings with the calm authority of someone who'd faced real threats and emerged victorious. When court resumed, the energy had fundamentally changed. Preston's attacks on Johnson's character felt increasingly desperate, his theatrical outrage forced and unconvincing. The jury looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware they were being asked to convict a man who'd earned the respect of the Marine Corps' highest-ranking officers. The weight of Morrison's silent testimony pressed down on everyone present like mountain air, thin, pure, and impossible to ignore. As Preston finally concluded his case, Judge Brennan faced a moment of decision that would define his legacy. He could continue his performance of contempt, dismissing Johnson as another problem citizen who needed to learn proper deference. Or he could acknowledge what everyone in the courtroom now understood, that he was presiding over the destruction of a genuine American hero's reputation based on nothing more than prejudice and political calculation. The judge's voice sounded strained as he addressed the courtroom, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. The presence of General Morrison had stripped away the theatrical trappings, revealing the proceedings for what they'd always been: a systematic attempt to humiliate a man whose only crime was believing he deserved equal treatment under law. Johnson remained motionless throughout the final arguments, his composure unshaken by the drama swirling around him. He'd faced Taliban snipers with less anxiety than he felt watching American justice struggle with its own contradictions. The mountains of Afghanistan had been simpler enemies clearly identified, mission parameters defined, success measured in American lives, saved rather than civilian approval ratings. But as General Morrison's presence continued to redefine the courtroom dynamic, Johnson began to feel something he hadn't experienced since returning from his final deployment: the possibility that his service might actually matter to people beyond his fellow veterans. Her silent support represented more than personal validation. It was institutional recognition that his sacrifices had meaning, that the Corps still stood behind Marines who'd answered the call to serve. The jury received their instructions as afternoon faded toward evening, fluorescent lights growing harsher as natural illumination declined. Judge Brennan's charge to the jurors lacked his earlier theatricality, his words carefully measured now that military authority observed every gesture and recorded every inflection for future reference. General Morrison remained in her seat as the jury filed out, her presence a constant reminder that some things transcended civilian politics and social prejudice. She'd commanded Marines in life-or-death situations, made decisions that sent young men and women into harm's way, carried responsibilities that civilian authorities could barely comprehend. Her judgment carried weight that no amount of prosecutorial theater could diminish. The waiting began then, that peculiar suspension of time that marked all significant moments in Johnson's military career. Waiting for orders, waiting for enemy contact, waiting for helicopters that might or might not arrive before ammunition ran out. He'd learned to exist in those spaces between action and resolution, to maintain alertness without anxiety, to trust in outcomes beyond his immediate control. But this wait felt different, charged with possibilities he'd barely dared to imagine. For the first time since the charges were filed, Johnson allowed himself to hope that justice might triumph over prejudice, that truth might emerge from beneath layers of social expectation and political calculation. The general's presence had changed more than the courtroom's atmosphere. It had reminded everyone present that America's ideals were worth defending, even in civilian courts that sometimes forgot their own principles. As darkness fell outside the courthouse windows, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman's voice carried across the silent courtroom, pronouncing words that would either vindicate or condemn everything Johnson had sacrificed for his country. But regardless of their decision, General Morrison's attendants had already delivered the most important verdict: that Marcus Johnson was a Marine worthy of respect. A man whose service commanded recognition. A veteran who'd earned his place in American society through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication to ideals larger than himself. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, as justice prepared to speak with a human voice, witnessed by a general who'd never forgotten that freedom's price was paid by people like Sergeant First Class Marcus Johnson, United States Marine Corps, who'd served his country with distinction and deserved nothing less than the full protection of the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. General Morrison rose slowly from her seat as the jury foreman prepared to read the verdict. The entire courtroom watched as she turned toward Johnson with the measured precision that marked every movement of senior military officers. Her face revealed nothing of her thoughts, but her actions spoke louder than any words could convey. She lifted her right hand in a crisp salute, fingers aligned perfectly, wrists straight, eyes locked on Johnson's with unmistakable respect. The gesture was sharp, precise, ceremonial, a recognition of one warrior by another that transcended rank, race, and the petty concerns of civilian politics. It was a salute offered between equals, from one who'd bled for America to another who'd done the same. Johnson's response was automatic, rising from his chair with the fluid motion of thousands of hours of military training. His hand came up in perfect form, holding the salute as long as protocol demanded, his eyes never leaving Morrison's. In that moment, the courtroom faded away, replaced by something larger and more meaningful than legal proceedings or social prejudice. The salute seemed to last forever, though it couldn't have been more than seconds. Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on the exchange between the general and the sergeant, witnessing something that transcended their understanding but commanded their respect. The silence was absolute, heavy with recognition that they were observing a ritual older than the Constitution itself, the acknowledgement of one warrior by another. When Morrison finally lowered her hand, the spell broke but the impact remained. She walked back up the aisle with the same measured pace she'd used entering the courtroom, her mission accomplished without a single word spoken. The doors closed behind her with finality, leaving behind a transformed space where assumptions had been shattered and truths revealed. Judge Brennan sat stunned behind his bench, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow recognition that he'd made a terrible mistake. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so strong when built on stereotypes and social prejudice, now appeared pathetic when measured against the reality of Johnson's service and sacrifice. Preston shuffled his papers with nervous energy, his political calculations suddenly seeming small and mean-spirited. The jury foreman's voice shook slightly as he read the verdict that everyone knew was now inevitable. Not guilty on all charges. The words fell into the silence left by Morrison's salute, carrying weight they wouldn't have possessed an hour earlier. Justice had been delayed, but not denied, delivered through the simple act of one soldier recognizing another's worth. Johnson accepted the verdict with the same composure he'd maintained throughout the trial, but those who knew how to look could see the relief in his eyes. Not relief at avoiding conviction, he'd never doubted his innocence, but relief that America could still surprise him, that justice could still triumph over prejudice when challenged by courage and moral clarity. As the courtroom emptied, people approached Johnson with expressions of apology and respect that had been absent when the day began. The businessman whose testimony had anchored the prosecution's case couldn't meet his eyes, hurrying past with shoulders hunched in shame. Others lingered, wanting to shake hands, to express gratitude they hadn't known they owed, to touch something real in a world increasingly dominated by shallow performance and empty gesture. Sarah Chen packed her files with quiet satisfaction, knowing she'd witnessed something that would define her entire legal career. She'd fought for Johnson because it was her job, but Morrison's salute had reminded her why the job mattered not for the victories or defeats, but for the moments when the system worked as designed, protecting those who'd sacrificed everything to preserve it. Outside the courthouse, Johnson walked into the cool evening air with steps lighter than they'd been in months. The stars were emerging overhead, distant points of light that had guided him through Afghan nights when the darkness seemed absolute. They looked the same now, offering the same silent promise that morning would come, that justice would eventually find its way through human weakness and political calculation. He thought of General Morrison as he walked toward his truck, understanding that her salute had been more than personal recognition. It was institutional acknowledgement that the Marine Corps stood behind its own, that service created bonds stronger than civilian prejudice, that honor was a real thing worth defending in courtrooms and foxholes alike. The parking lot was nearly empty, most observers having fled when the narrative they'd expected failed to materialize. Johnson's footsteps echoed off concrete walls, marking time with the measured pace he'd learned in recruit training 30 years ago. Each step took him farther from the courthouse and closer to whatever came next, but with the knowledge that America could still surprise him, still live up to the ideals he'd sworn to defend. Behind him, the courthouse lights dimmed one by one as custodians secured the building for the night. Judge Brennan's office window went dark last of all, a final acknowledgement that some performances were destined to end in defeat when confronted by truth and moral courage. Johnson drove home through empty streets, past houses where families slept safely because men and women like him had been willing to stand watch in dangerous places. The radio played soft jazz that reminded him of the music his father had loved, melodies that spoke of better times and enduring hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to the memory of a general's salute and the recognition that service mattered, sacrifice was real, and justice could still triumph in America when courage demanded it. The stars followed him home, unchanged and unchanging, witnesses to human drama that played out beneath their light across centuries of American history. They had watched over Valley Forge and Gettysburg, over Normandy and Iwo Jima, over the countless battlefields where Americans had bled and died for principles that sometimes seemed forgotten but never truly disappeared. Tonight they watched over Marcus Johnson, United States Marine Corps, retired, driving home with his dignity restored, and his faith in America strengthened by the simple act of one warrior acknowledging another's worth.